That's what we're going to do after this.
I don't know. After. I think they keep them in a hospital. I don't know if they keep them in a food. You don't know how long they
Keep those
how
door.
long away
So today we're going to be talking about something called the Reformation. You could also say Reformation, but it's pronounced Reformation. So this is one of Luther's letters that he wrote. Martin Luther is probably the most famous reformer. Here's a close-up look at it. You can see it's not written in English, it's written in German, because he was German. So there's three parts to this that we're going to be talking about over the next few weeks. This is your chapter 8, so we're leaving chapter 7 behind. We're starting chapter 8. The Reformation begins, and one of the major players in this Reformation movement is Martin Luther. The Reformation is going to spread, and one of the reasons that it's going to spread is because of the printing press. And then there's going to be something called the Counter-Reformation, which is the Catholic response to the Reformation. So there's going to be calls for church reform. Politics and Lutheranism is something else we're going to be talking about this week. That's 8.1. In 8.2, we're going to be talking about a guy named John Calvin and the English Reformation. And in 7.3, we're going to talk about the Counter-Reformation and the legacy of the Reformation. So today we're going to do 8.1, which is calls for church reform. So Roman numeral 1 for 8.1 is calls for church reform. So we're just doing notes regular today. We're going to work on that worksheet after we've done this. So calls for the Reformation. So in order to understand Reformation, you have to understand where it comes from. Reformation comes from the word reform. Does anyone know what the word reform means? Does anybody on this side of the room know what reform means? How about toward the third row? Does anyone in the third row know what reform means? No?
Oh, I don't mean
Taylor, what does it mean?
change that tries to bring about an improvement.
So reform is a change that tries to bring about improvement. So if you were going to reform something at this school to bring an improvement, what's one thing that you guys, just off the top of your head? Let's not talk while I'm talking. What's one thing, if you could reform something at the school to make it better, what would it be? Courtney?
Food.
How would you reform it? Pizza's gross, so you want something else besides pizza? Taylor?
A pool.
You want a pool?
Yeah.
So those are some of the things. Nick, did you have one?
The homework.
What?
The homework.
No homework? Okay. So there are some things, for better or worse, that you guys think might be make school better. Haley?
Everyone gets straight A's no matter what.
Everyone gets straight A's no matter what, okay. So these are all somewhat reforms, but when you think about reforms, you have to think what's best for students. If everyone just got A's, would that be good for the students, or would they just be lazy because they would just get straight A's no matter what?
Kind of both.
Kind of both. Maybe there's pluses and minuses to reform. So that's what they were talking about. And reform comes from the word form. So for those of you guys who are visual, you can see there's different forms in the world. There's circles, triangles. And also when you're doing pottery, have you ever seen a pottery wheel? When it's spinning, you form. And so if you're going to reform something, you change the size of it, basically. So you change it to make it better. Like if someone's making pottery and doesn't like the way he's making it, he'll change it so it'll be better. And that's kind of what reform is. So reform is just a change of form, or to make it better. And so the Reformation was a change of form in the church. You guys don't have to write this part down, but so the technical definition. Oh wait, this is another example. Is like football. You have a formation, right? You have an offensive and a defensive formation. If you reform it, the only reason you can reform it to make the formation is to make it better, or to sort of, if you see what your opponent is doing, you want to make your formation so it fits their formation. So that's another way you can understand reformation. It's just, there's a lot of different ways to understand it, but you need to understand the word so that you know what it means. So here's the technical definition. It's the beginning of a movement in Christianity known as Protestantism. And the first thing that we're going to be writing down is, why do people believe there was a need for reform in the church? So the first part is the background. Okay. First thing is that the Catholics had a practice called indulgences, which are somewhat complicated, but the simple way that you guys should understand it is that it is a pardon for sins. There's two types of sins in the world. There's mortal sin, and most of the time if you commit a mortal sin, it's like suicide or you murder someone. Those are mortal sins. And the reason, what the Catholic Church says is that that creates a barrier between you and God, so you can't get to it, right? There's also something called venial sins, which are more minor sins. Things like gluttony, things that aren't going to keep you out of heaven forever. If you commit a mortal sin, there's no way you can really make up for it in the Catholic tradition. And so there's this barrier, and so what indulgences do is they create a bridge so that you can get back to God, according to this Catholic tradition. And it sort of lessens the amount of payment you have to do, like penance. Have you guys ever seen one of these? Or wait, have you seen one of these before?
Yeah.
What are they? Someone raise their hand and tell me. Robert?
Rosary?
Rosary. What is a rosary? What do you do with it? You know?
Yes, you know, like, I'm not sure how to explain it.
Raphael, how do you explain it?
You pray with it.
You pray with it, right?
Yeah.
And that's one way of doing penance, is you pray for forgiveness. Now what ended up happening was this stuff started becoming corrupted. And people started saying, well, instead of praying, or instead of all you have to do is, so they started selling indulgences for money to peasants. So that's the second thing you need to know. So there was these indulgences, and people started not being very happy about it. Because people thought the Catholic Church was becoming too concerned with money. And you're going to see one of the most famous reformers is Martin Luther, and that's someone that we're going to be spending a lot of time talking about. We're going to be watching a movie called Luther. Okay, there's two people in the world. Martin Luther King Jr. was a civil rights leader in the 1950s in America. Martin Luther, not Martin Luther King, just Martin Luther, lived 500 years ago, and he was the one of the people who started this thing called the Reformation. And we're going to talk about him in a minute. But he was a Christian leader who opposed the Catholic Church, certain practices of the Catholic Church. Anyone need more time on this one? Anyone know who's on the $10 bill? No. It's actually not a president. Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton. He was one of the secretaries of the treasury. Okay, you guys ready to go on? So who called for Reformation in the church? That's the next thing that we're going to be talking about. The first guy was Erasmus. He was a famous Christian humanist. Remember in Italy and the Renaissance we talked about humanism? Well, it didn't go away, but when it traveled this part of Europe, it became something known as Christian humanism, which is basically going back to the sources to understand the way the Bible was originally written. So these people would go back, because the Old Testament was originally written in Hebrew and the New Testament was originally written in Greek, and so they'd go back and study Hebrew and Greek. John Wycliffe translated the Bible from English to Latin. Another really famous guy. He was famous because he stood up against the church and said that Jesus Christ and not the Pope was sort of the head of the church, and that you should understand the Bible and not necessarily just listen to the Pope. So he questioned the Pope's authority, which was a big deal back then. William Tyndale also printed an English version of the New Testament. The difference between Wycliffe and Tyndale is that Wycliffe translated it from Latin, which was the language of which church? Catholic Church, right? Tyndale translated the Bible from the actual Greek and Hebrew, which was the original languages they were written in, and became something known as the King James Bible, King James Version. Has anyone ever heard of the King James Version? It's written in really old English. It's kind of hard to understand. They have newer versions, like the New King James. There's a lot of different versions of the Bible, but this was one of the first, and it became known as the authorized version, the King James Version. So what you're going to be doing with this sheet in a minute, after we've finished all the notes, there's still a little bit more notes, is we're going to be looking at all these different